This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
I want to ask the media to avoid mentioning the name and showing the picture of the person involved. Do not give him the gift of infamy. Let us instead focus all our intention and attention on the lives we lost and the families and friends who grieve.
You just heard there Justin Trudeau talking about the media and asking the media not to report the name and identity of the Nova Scotia killer. Now, this is something that as a person in media, I have a bit of an issue with, and I'll talk about this in a couple of moments, but it really does touch on a No Notoriety campaign that's been going around mostly in the United States for the last several years, and the campaign that basically aims to take away the notoriety that the media tends to bestow on the perpetrators of mass killings. I want to talk about this with someone who had actually introduced me to this in the wake of the Parkland shooting a couple of years back, and that is Professor Jaclyn Schildkraut. She's the author of the book Mass Shootings, Media, Myths, and Realities, and a professor at the State University of New York at Oswego in the Department of Criminal Justice. Professor Schildkraut joins me. Thank you so much for your time. Really great to talk to you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So the No Notoriety campaign seems to be based on this idea that if you give killers fame, it's going to embolden future killers. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, if you think about it, when we look at, these individuals, and certainly in the case of the Nova Scotia shooter, it's, still very premature. We don't really know a lot about, him in particular. But a lot of these individuals who go out and a lot of these individuals who go out and conduct these types of very public, events or public shootings will tell people in advance that they want to be famous and they want to have their name in lights. And so it's sort of a twofold thing. Certainly, we don't want to incentivize other individuals to go out and carry similar acts, but at the same time, we don't want to reward people for doing something like what these individuals are doing.
I guess the big challenge that I have with I guess there are two. When a politician is asking the media to do it, that part as someone in the media doesn't necessarily sit right with me. But there is still a prerogative for media outlets themselves to come up with these policies and guidelines. I think we can look at some absolutely horrendous examples of media doing what I would say is glamorizing. I think that Rolling Stone cover from one of the Boston bombers a couple of years ago is probably one of the more noteworthy examples of that. But I guess what I would ask is there a way that the reporting can be done more respectfully that doesn't need to manifest itself as a blanket ban, even if it's self-imposed, on reporting names?
Well, so I think that there's, a couple things to take into consideration. Number one is that even the No Notoriety campaign, which was started in the aftermath of the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting, has never said complete blackout blanket, no names ever. There is there is a value in reporting that as a fact. But I think where the issue comes in and where notoriety is really speaking from is you can say it once in the beginning of the story and then simply refer to them as the perpetrator. To continue to name them over and over again or to put up their picture, that's where you're putting a face to the name. And the reality is that you can still tell the who, what, when, where, why, and how of a story without having to give somebody credit for doing something so horrific.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point, because a lot of the time when we see these stories, a lot of, I would say media reporting tends to go down the killer, the shooter, the perpetrator anyway. So to do that with a bit more intentionality wouldn't be that much of a change, but it would make a difference, it sounds like, in that overall notoriety that the killer is getting.
Well, one of the things is that, you have these individuals who are relatively unknown people, and in many cases completely unknown outside of their own social circles. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that people know their name. For instance, I grew up in the Parkland community, and our shooter, literally before he went into the school, said, I want everybody to know my name. I want, to be famous. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. There's nobody in this country and probably the world that doesn't know what his name is. And so if you remove just the identity component where you're not giving them credit for something like that, then that can be very helpful. You can still say all of the facts of the case, the perpetrator, for instance, in Parkland, went into this building. He had this type of gun. He did these actions, and this is how many people died. But you're not giving that individual that, that credit or that glory.
What's the view that you have on reporting things like backstory and history of killers? Because I think a lot of the time that's where, in some cases, coverage can look like it's glamorizing or romanticizing a story. And I don't think that's necessarily the intention of these things. But do you think that there should be some holding back on reporting those life stories of some of these people?
I don't necessarily think that there needs to be, for me as a researcher, because we don't have access to a lot of, investigatory documents, and oftentimes there's not as much available to the police that there is to the media, which is always very interesting. There is a value in having that information. If we understand what led up to, 0 point, then we can try and identify opportunities for intervention in future incidents. I think where it becomes a challenge for those of us from the No Notoriety camp is, number one, the way in which it's presented. Certainly this over glamorization, kind of like you mentioned with the Boston bomber. Like, we don't need to know if they wore affliction T-shirts and had tousled hair, kind of thing. We just need to know the facts. But also, I think that there is such a overemphasis on the shooter, rather than also an equal acknowledgement, at the very least, equal acknowledgement of the lives of the people that they took. And, we tend to think about this one individual and all of the bad things that they did, but there's not as much attention paid to all of the good that they took. And, we talk about victims as, numbers, right? Columbine, they're 1 of 13. Parkland, they're 1 of 17. Now in Nova Scotia, they're going to be 1 of 22, or whatever the final death toll ends up being. And the reality is that they're not one of anything. They are humans. They have stories, and those stories also need to be told.
That's so key, and I'm glad it's something you've done in your work as well. And I know that it must be very difficult for you having to rehash some of these things, but, I've seen you mark anniversaries and bring victims' names. And for me, I have to admit that I get a bit ashamed when I look at some of these victims that you talk about from cases going back years, and I could tell you the shooter, but I couldn't name a single victim from any of these cases.
It's really interesting. After Parkland, which obviously for me is a very different sort of beast, if you will, because it's where I'm from. I can remember being in a meeting with one of our task forces here, and there happened to be a reporter who's done a lot of stories for the New York Times, and she just kept rattling on with the Aurora shooter's name. And at that point, it was maybe a month out of the shooting. So personally, on a personal level, I was very raw. And I literally said to this room with like the most high-powered people in our city, listen, we're on the 5th floor of this building. I will bet you guys every penny in my bank account, go downstairs and ask anybody the Parkland shooter's name, and then ask that person to name one person that he killed, because they're not going to know, but I know all 17. And I understand that my connection is different, but, even just learning about one victim, I've gotten to not only, learn about them and share their stories online, but many of the families I've connected with. I've learned about Hannah Ehlers from Beaumont, California, and her 3 amazing children and her husband, and, all of these different people that had lives and had stories, and people who have lost loved ones in very, very horrific ways beyond their control.
When you look at that No Notoriety campaign, if more media outlets and individuals adopt this, is there a risk that it could have an inverse effect where shooters that do want fame realize they have to up their game and be the worst and the deadliest and go so far that they would then get the notoriety they seek?
That's a really interesting question. I think that, we're sort of already seeing an element of that because they do study one another. And certainly as my research has shown, the media blanketly, of course, we used one source, but there tends to be a greater emphasis, even just in the amount of coverage or the placement of coverage of those shootings that are more lethal. If somebody kills 2 people, that's not going to be covered the way Las Vegas was with 58 people, now 59 people, and same with Parkland, had 17 people, but earlier that year, the shooting in Marshall County, Kentucky had 2 people. They weren't talked about any which way the same. And so, I think that we're already seeing that element. So I don't know that removing that incentive would really change things one way or another, because if the practice was, we're going to limit the name no matter how many people you kill, certainly that might all just blanketly work. I mean, I hope.
Do you find that all of these shooters really are very similar to one another, or is every shooter created differently?
I think every shooter is created differently in many respects, but there also are similarities, and the similarities come more within the way in which they go from, seemingly normal person to mass killer. There is a model out there from Dr. Reed Malloy, who is a preeminent scholar in this field, and it's called the Pathway to Violence model. And basically, if you look at, each case, while there may be differences in terms of, social or demographic characteristics, the general trajectory is the same. They all start with some type of a grievance, whether it's perceived or real, something really happened, like they lost their job, or they think they're bullied, or they think they're ostracized, or, whatever the case may be. And at some point after they're sitting there, kind of festering on it, they make a decision that they're going to exact revenge against that grievance in a very specific way. And so then, their pre-attack preparations tend to, again, follow the same patterns in terms of weapons gathering and probing and breaching into locations and seeing what they're going to do and their logistical planning. And all of these different steps along this pathway, which, again, we learn about through the way in which their backstories are told, allows us to identify opportunities for intervention or for a way to de-escalate it before it becomes a full-blown shooting.
In Nova Scotia, of course, I think the day after this shooting ended, we already had politicians talking about gun control, which in the Canadian context is already very strict. So it's not as simple as linking it to, how you might see a response in some American jurisdictions. Do you think it is too simplistic when oftentimes people focus on one aspect after one of these shootings?
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about mass shootings, there's a lot of things that all kind of go into play with it. There's a lot of factors, and they all happen to converge at precisely one, point in time. Certainly there are people who will argue, well, if there were no guns, there would be no shootings. And that might be true, but that doesn't mean there's no weapons. There's other forms of weapons. We saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, here in America, that in the absence of a gun, someone used a car. The same day that Sandy Hook happened at a Chinese elementary school, somebody knifed 22 children the exact same day. So, offenders will find a way, regardless of what their weapon selection is, if they want to inflict maximum casualty or maximum harm. And so looking beyond just the means to what is the reasoning behind it is extremely important. And that's why it's so multifaceted. It's not just one thing, but collectively as in not only our nation, but I think within the world, everybody seems to hone in on the very first thing because that's the easiest thing to go for. Everything that is going on in the process that leads them up to it is far more complex, and it needs a much more protracted and long-ranging conversation.
One of the things that I certainly see in myself, and I'm sure you see it in a lot of other people, is that there is this desire for answers, and nothing ever satisfies that. And how have you come to terms with this? I mean, you're immersed in this more than anyone else is. How do you, in your own mind, kind of find peace with this when you just see the evil that exists in the world?
I appreciate you asking that. I don't actually get asked that a lot. I think for me, really kind of, again, focusing in on the victims and saying, what can I do from my little place and my little corner in the world to make sure that other families don't have this happen to them? What can I do? And so for me, since Parkland, I've been very focused on emergency preparedness training. When I learned about the fact that, kids in that building had never, ever been through a lockdown drill, the teachers had received very minimal training. And from my perspective, had either of those things happened, that shooting may have had a very different outcome. So I've spent 2 years training school districts on how to respond in these events. But also, I think for me is just realizing that the conversation needs to change, and I work really, really hard to change that. One of the things that I learned in the last 2.5 years is the most dangerous thing in all of this is not the gun. The most dangerous thing in all of this is the mentality that it can never happen here. Because the minute that you say it can never happen here is the minute your guard is dropped and you've become extremely complacent. And that's when it can, or, you know, maybe is more likely because you're not as, you know, aware or, you know, kind of thinking about what's going on around you. And that's really the mentality that I've been trying to change. And I still hear people say it, you know, one of the big things right now that's come out in America, and I don't know if it's come out up there, is, well, there were no school shootings in March. Well, there was no students in school. So no kidding, there was no school shooting. But that doesn't mean that we're not having mass homicide and we're not having all of these other issues. We seem to, as humans, only be able to focus on one thing and that very worst thing, but not think about all of the other things that are going on. So I just try to use the platform that I've been given to educate people, to call these types of problems into focus, and hope that even if I can change one person's perspective, it will make a difference in the long run.
Well, I think that's a very worthwhile perspective, and I'm glad you were able to share it, and also glad you were able to take the time to speak to us today. Joining me on the line, Professor Jaclyn Schildkraut, professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the State University of New York at Oswego, also author of the book Mass Shootings, Media, Myths, and Realities. Professor, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.